Hello all. Today we are beginning to talk about the final unit of our course. If we began, if our course is structured around this 3-unit idea that we looked at the ancient world and we looked at the medieval world, and then finally we'll look at the early modern world. Today we're in that transition moment. And what I want to do in this short lecture is just spend a few minutes introducing what do we mean when we talk about early modern world. And I've even tried to advance my animation skills with it. So I don't know how it's going to go. Right. Oh, let me turn back up. Okay. So when we talk about the transition from the early modern world, we're talking about a world that transitions from legends of Prester John. Here is a medieval manuscript depiction of Prester John, who was believed to be off in Africa, somewhere as the leader of a Christian kingdom in Africa. And this was the worldview from the ancient world. This is a Ptolemaic map from Ptolemy. Remember the Ptolemaic kingdom in the wake of Alexander the Great way back then in the ancient world? Well, that's what we mean when we're talking about this Ptolemaic map. It's coming from the ancient world, and it is what had been, for the most educated people, the view of what the geography of the world was. So you see what appears to be a Eurasian continent, a European continent, Eurasia, Asia somewhere over here, and Africa down here. They knew the Mediterranean. Even you can see the boot of Italy, not too bad for the world they knew. The Arabian Peninsula, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the subcontinent of India. That map had been developing over centuries at some level. But what happens in the early modern period is, because of maritime exploration, the worldview changes tremendously, and 2 more continents are discovered in North America and South America. Tanzania and Australia also discovered. Greenland probably already had been. But this is a major change. So this is one of the differences in the early modern world, and politically, we start to see a map of really a major European empire in the Spanish Empire that occupies a great swath of Europe, the Habsburgs, as well as much of the new discoveries in the late 15th and 16th centuries in the Western Hemisphere. So just in terms of what we know about geography, the early modern period is a very dynamic period. But that is not this, if that was all we had to say about the early modern period, we would have a very different story. This is going to go too fast. We have new types of technology emerging: military technology, printing press, architectural technology in the heart of the Renaissance. We have all kinds of artworks, our new artwork. It's a tremendously fertile period in terms of artwork. And here we have the work of Leonardo da Vinci. One of his most famous works is the Mona Lisa. It gets produced in the early modern period, as does this painting we'll talk more about from our Northern Renaissance, indicating new ways of people expressing themselves, what they have in their home, what gets painted. We used to be in a world where what got painted were religious scenes in the eastern part of the world, icons. And now the Renaissance gives way to a world that is much more indulgent about painting the things of life, celebrating individuals. Portraiture becomes major. In the early modern period, we also see the scientific, what we call the scientific revolution, new understandings of not just geography, as we saw with some maps on the previous slide, but how the cosmos is organized and how to learn about the cosmos and geography and the natural world. This period gives way to the scientific method. We may not know everything, but we can agree on how to establish truth and how to go about establishing truths. Not that establishing truth is a new idea. At any rate, we also see in the early modern period a new type of ruler, and Elizabeth I is just one of many, many famous figures of the early modern period when the nature of statehood is changing very much. In the earlier sections of the early modern period, we'll see rulers like Henry VIII who are making claims of absolutism, really strengthening the state. And that is a stage that we see in the early modern period that when we think about it in terms of state building is the name that historians often give. And I'll invite you to keep in tension this idea of state building and absolute power along with different sources of legitimacy and representation from the people. Because as we know, there isn't only one game in town. And throughout the medieval period, towns with municipal burghers that are making arrangements with kings and establishing rights, and nobles that from King John in the Magna Carta managed to secure, even for a small franchise, some degree of rights. We're seeing different ways of organizing states. So we'll keep our eye on that. And then finally, this picture down here is a picture of Martin Luther nailing his famous 95 Theses up on the door in Germany, and as a symbol of catalyzing a real shaking up of the way that Christendom is organized. So these are all some of the things, some of the themes: technology, art, the Renaissance, scientific revolution, military revolution, rulership and state building, and the Reformation that Willie will be starting to survey in our next several lectures. Really quickly, I'm just going to show you a couple of maps now. So here is a map of Europe in roughly 1300. And one of the things we'll notice, which is no surprise to you now because we've talked about this, the fragmented political order under what's been described as feudal or medieval Europe. And this is there, we see very much that not a few states, but many, many states, although England and France and Hungary, Castile are large operators, and then the Western Kipchak, or more colloquially referred to as the Golden Horde over here, although Golden Horde, it doesn't appear in any source until the 17th century. They referred to themselves as these descendants of the Mongols, thought of themselves as the Kipchak Horde. So kudos to this map for being hewing closer to the historical record for names used in 1300. Here's a picture of the map in 1400, and it's a very changed political scene. The Polish-Lithuanian arrangement is starting to arise, although, yeah, the battle, an agreement at Krevo in 1380 formed a kind of partnership between Poland and Lithuania, although the actual Commonwealth isn't going to get formed until 1569. But anyway, we're not totally going for accuracy here. We're just sort of taking some snapshot pictures of the political organization of Europe so that you can just have a sense of evolution and have a sense that the states that exist even on the map today, they have a history and they didn't always exist exactly in that form. States are human formations, and they have been, they're created by humans, they're modified by humans. Here is a map slightly different in 1470. We could do this for a really long time, and it is really, and you can find all kinds of maps, and it can be a fun exercise to drill down and attempt to determine the historical accuracy of them. Here's a map of around 1500, and Here's another map of about 1500 looking quite different. And one of the things that you do see here, Spain is emerging as a state, France, England, Poland, Hungary is a major state. Here's the empire, often referred to as the Holy Roman Empire or known as Germany. That is going to be one of the later forming territories to come together in form a nation. Germany and Italy don't unify into nations that we call Germany and Italy into the 19th century, although these terms exist for centuries prior to their actual formation as unified states. As we will be keeping our eye on the political formations and evolutions, and to be clear, we are not going to dig deep into the histories of particular states, but maybe just refer to examples, particular examples in history to illustrate trends that are happening, or to give a nod to building our knowledge about important historical reigns. So I just showed you several maps drawing boundaries on various political formations and said, oh, look how they're changing. But the other thing that's changing, and here we're talking about the Reformation, is the religious map. And by the end of our course, a more or less unified Christendom in Western Europe, notwithstanding the split with the Orthodox world that had continued to obtain, Christendom will split. The Catholic Church will break into various branches, most generally grouped together as Protestant. It began out of a protest, and this happens in the Reformation. We'll talk more about that. And so this is just that long process of state formation in the early modern period. What is the early modern period? Well, chronologically, people date it differently. And this is never going to be a hill I'm going to die on. Periodization is one of these things that we kind of use as a blunt instrument, maybe to try and define certain aspects of a reign or a period in history. But my personal take is we never want to get too wed to features, because one thing historians generally do is define a period, and then other historians come along and show how that doesn't quite work, or maybe the dates are different. And that's part of what makes studying the past vibrant. But at any rate, early modern, the early modern period, kind of this transitional, the very name early to something else suggests a sort of tradition, not quite modern, but not quite medieval either. And the chronology can vary on it, whether people say 1450 to 1750 or 1450 or 1500 to 1800. Here's a map that I just took off of Wikipedia, and this attempts to, for various regions of the world, situate them in the early modern period, the early modern period being yellow. And you see there a good deal of variations from 1450, or putting the start of the early modern period into the mid 16th century. And then in some of these places, bringing the modern period all the way up to 1850, as we see in the Russian case. I don't agree with that one at all, but be that as it may, what defines an early modern period? How do we define it? Well, do we define it in terms of political events? If we say what kind of organization is happening, what political features are relevant, is one way that people define the early modern period. And in that case, they might say, well, from the end of the 100 Years' War in the 15th century, or from the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks toppling Constantinople in 1453. 1453 is a super important date. These are some major political events around which we kind of hone in the beginning of the early modern period. And while this is much more amorphous, and I say that because I think actually people tend to see the early modern period as beginning with the Renaissance, which isn't a concrete political event. It's more of a cultural movement. We'll talk about the Renaissance as well. But when I thought about how to talk about determining the dates, it does seem to make sense that if you want to bookend it with similar things. So what similar things might bookend the Renaissance in terms of political events? If it's harder to determine how it begins, it's easier, I think, to determine how it ends. And many people see the French Revolution of 1789 as a definitive break between the early modern and modern period. We won't talk about the French Revolution in our class, besides to kind of assign it this potentially major importance as marking the end of the early modern period. If we were going to define this period in terms of more political metrics. But that isn't the only way that the early modern period gets defined. People might define it in terms of economic trends. So one way of thinking about it is maybe the kind of the end of serfdom, which I don't defend strongly at all. I actually think that the Renaissance is a kind of clearer beginning bookend, because serfdom just gets going in Eastern Europe once it's already done in Western Europe. And so that's one reason why I don't think the end of serfdom is such a good indicator as a start. And I'd probably more situate the Renaissance. But in terms of ending the early modern period, one way in which historians have decided to end it is looking at ways in which the economies work. And if it can be a little bit difficult to find the origins of something, Mark Bloch's talked about the kind of demon of origins. It always sends you further back. When are we seeing highly organized merchant capital happening? When do these diverse fairs go from being a one-off thing to something that really has a critical mass about it, and we can call it a change in the way the economy functions? That said, many historians see the Industrial Revolution as the end of the early modern period, where the early modern world gives way to modernity. But there's a wrinkle in this. Now historians have sort of understood there's two industrial revolutions. There's the Industrial Revolution that we kind of date to the 1820s, 1830s, when we have the coal-fired steam engine, this mechanical invention that enables heavy things to be moved without manpower, without a horse pushing a cart. The Industrial Revolution, the steam-powered and then coal-powered Industrial Revolution, is a major game changer in the way that economic work is accomplished. But other historians have come along and said, actually, there are already really important changes going on well before we have the steam engine at work in any factories or pulling coal out of the ground in England. We see a major differences in how labor is organized around the textile industry. And we start to see these changes in the second half of the 18th century. In England and in the Low Countries down there, that's now Belgium and the Netherlands, we start to see major changes that indicate to us that we are already into a more modern world, that you have major trading companies that presage the world of multinational corporations. So that's all a lot. That is just some comments on what is this thing, the early modern period chronologically, and how do people decide what it is. And as you saw, I'm not giving you definitive answers, but generally, if you say 1500 to 1800, 1450 to 1750, from the Renaissance to the French Revolution, those are, I think, defensible answers as you go on in life. I want to say a little bit more about features of the early modern period, or what's different between the medieval early modern period and then the modern world. And one of the things, and so now I'll just kind of give you a list, and it doesn't necessarily all relate to each other. But one thing we see different about this world is that states, the way territory defines states. Now we all, in the modern world, we think of the territory as defining the state. There's fixed boundaries. If they move, it's because of some major event, a war or some treaty or annexation or something, but we associate states with territory. In the pre-modern world, that was less the case. Remember when we talked about the feudal world and vassalage and lords, you would have courts that moved and brought their paperwork with them as paperwork became more and more important. So states could be less fixed territorially. Also, in the medieval and early modern world, we see dynastic marriage as being a quite typical way of organizing the succession of legitimate political authority. That tends not to be a feature of modern states. And next, in the early modern world, we see less in the way of a public-private distinction. Medieval states can sometimes be described as patrimonial states, and it was usually a patris, a man, the father, the man, who was the head of the state, although there are exceptions. But there was this idea that the wealth of the state is the wealth of the ruler, that what happened at court, this engagement in sociability that took money to put out these nice feasts or whatnot, was there was no drawing of lines between the court sociability for pleasure and what was actual political business. In the modern world makes this distinction. It's what a budget is all about, that because after all, what are states but the gathering of resources and then just redistribution of resources according to some predetermined rules. And one of the fundamental acts of modern statehood is to keep track of those budgets and make sure that resources are doled out according to agreed upon procedures and priorities, right? So in the medieval world, it would be absolutely normal to just appoint your son as your major advisor and no questions asked. In modernity, however, we start to see a system that self-fashions itself as demanding merit for appointments and reasons for advancement. So you just wouldn't see a son or a daughter appointed as a major head of state advisor without having credentials to follow it up. Go figure. Here we are in 2020. But at any rate, before 2016, I would give this lecture and just point out how much in the American press we talked about Castro appointing his brother as this major resource, and how that was an indication of a state not functioning properly, because we in the United States had mastered and become so good at making these distinctions and appointing authority based on electoral legitimacy or merit in the case of peopling the bureaucracy that it takes to run a modern state. Other differences between pre-modern and modern. Well, states had much less capacity in the pre-modern age, and so they didn't do much in the way of enforcement. They had armies, but not so much of a police force. Modern states are characterized by having much greater police forces. And as far as states go, and I'll talk about this more when we talk about the military revolution, Through much of history, wars were fought according campaign by campaign. And the army was called up when it was time for campaign, and then they dispersed and went about their business. Indeed, in the medieval Europe, where there were those who fight and those who prayed and those who worked the land, and so much political contention, knights could spend much of their year engaged in military campaigns. But it was nonetheless different than having a standing army, soldiers that are always at work. And despite the actual language of the US Constitution, the United States does and has for a long time had what is effectively a standing army. So those are some of the differences between the early modern and the pre-modern, the medieval early modern world and modernity. Here's another kind of list that I might put before you without elaborating, that sort of, well, actually, a sort of list of distinctions that are made about the pre-modern versus modern world. And what I would say to you is that in the early modern era, we find both of these, we find all of these principles very much interacting. I think it's one of the reasons it makes studying the early modern period so rich and so endlessly fascinating and hard to generalize about as well, because you have religion and superstition and the church and agrarian economy, community identities as hugely important. At the same time, we see the emergence of science, of rationality, of notions of secular law that are different from church law. We start to see a more diverse economy. Not everyone is a peasant or a soldier anymore. Commerce becomes an increasingly important sector of the world, and something to which more people devote their days, whether as through traders, buyers, sellers, artisans. And a sense of the individual emerges. Some people, when they talk about the Renaissance, Jakob Burckhardt was famous for saying this is the age in which a real sense of the individual emerges. We have portraits and self-portraits and thinkers like Montaigne and Descartes thinking about just what it means to be an individual. And then I've said a little bit already about the state. If we would say a pre-modern state is a state where there's little or no distinction between what's the kings and what's the kingdoms, where all the politics are personal as opposed to being subordinate to rule of law. In this, the modern state, there's this greater sense of a public sphere, a state treasury, and the state existing as an abstract territorial entity, regardless of the ruler. More to come, but with that, we will end this introduction to early modernity. Thank you.